Welcome, weary traveler, to tonight's journey into the shadowy heart of the medieval world. Tonight we won't focus on kings, battles, or grand cathedrals. Instead, we're gently tiptoeing into the murky landscape of medieval witchcraft. Now, before we even begin to discuss supposed witches and dark magic, it's vital that we understand the mental environment of the time, a world saturated with superstition. Think of it as the very air they breathed, as natural as the sunrise, and just as unavoidable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a world with limited scientific understanding. The world around you, my friend, is largely a mystery. The causes of everyday occurrences, from a failed harvest to a sudden illness, remain shrouded in the unknown. There was no germ theory, no understanding of meteorology beyond simple observations, no real grasp on how the human body actually worked. Instead, people relied on explanations rooted in faith, folklore, and a generous helping of, well, let's just call it educated guesswork. Let's set the scene a little more vividly, shall we? Think of the sun, not as a giant ball of fusing hydrogen, but as a chariot driven across the sky by a god. An eclipse, not a celestial alignment, but a dragon trying to devour the sun, requiring a cacophony of noise from the villagers to scare it away. A simple fever wasn't a virus, but perhaps demonic influence or the result of displeasing a local spirit. Superstitions, therefore, weren't just quaint little beliefs. They were a framework for understanding everything. It was their science, their medicine, and their explanation for the unpredictable nature of life. Natural disasters like floods, earthquakes, or plagues were interpreted as divine punishment, visited upon humanity for their sins. A particularly harsh winter might mean that God was unhappy with the village. A bountiful harvest was a sign of divine favor. Life was a constant negotiation with the unseen forces that governed their world. Now, I know what you might be thinking, but weren't they Christian? Didn't they believe in God? Absolutely, Christianity was the dominant force, shaping morals, social structures, and daily life. But medieval Christianity wasn't quite the neat, tidy, and homogeneous belief system we might imagine. It was layered with older traditions, pagan beliefs, and localized interpretations that created a rich and complex tapestry of faith. Think of it like this: Christianity provided the grand narrative, the overall structure of good versus evil, heaven and hell, and the importance of salvation. However, the everyday practicalities of life were often governed by older, more localized beliefs. For example, while the church taught about angels and saints, many people also believed in fairies, elves, and other spirits that inhabited the forests, fields, and waterways. These spirits, neither inherently good nor evil, could be helpful or harmful, depending on how they were treated. Leaving out offerings of milk or bread for the local fairies, for instance, might ensure a good harvest or protect your livestock. Neglecting them, well, you might find your milk souring or your animals falling ill. Charms, amulets, and rituals were common ways to ward off bad luck or attract good fortune. A horseshoe nailed above the door was meant to protect against evil spirits. Carrying a particular stone or herb might safeguard you on a journey. Saying specific prayers or performing certain actions could prevent illness or ensure a successful business venture. These practices weren't necessarily seen as contradictory to Christianity, but rather as supplementary ways to interact with the spiritual world. A little extra insurance, if you will. The concept of luck played a significant role in this superstitious mindset. Life was perceived as inherently precarious, and success or failure often attributed to forces beyond human control. A run of bad luck could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or the influence of malevolent forces. Conversely, a streak of good fortune might be seen as a blessing or the result of a lucky charm. Dreams were also considered significant. They weren't just random firings of neurons, but potential messages from the divine, warnings of impending danger, or glimpses into the future. Interpreting dreams was a common practice, and dream dictionaries offered guidance on deciphering their hidden meanings. Did you dream of a wedding? That might mean a funeral was on the way. Did you dream of flying? Good luck was coming your way, but beware of getting a big head. The weather, of course, was a constant source of anxiety and superstition. Farmers relied on weather lore passed down through generations to predict rainfall, temperature changes, and the likelihood of storms. Certain animal behaviors, cloud formations, or even the appearance of the moon could be interpreted as signs of impending weather events. These observations, while sometimes accurate, were often mixed with wishful thinking and outright superstition. The human body, itself, was seen as vulnerable to all sorts of invisible influences. Illness wasn't simply a matter of physical malfunction, but an imbalance of humors or the result of spiritual attack. Medieval medicine relied heavily on astrology, believing that the position of the planets and stars influenced health and well-being. Certain days were considered auspicious for bloodletting or surgery, while others were to be avoided at all costs. A person's astrological sign was thought to influence their personality, temperament, and susceptibility to certain illnesses. All of these beliefs, these superstitions, these interconnected webs of folk wisdom and religious conviction, combined to create a world where the line between the natural and the supernatural was constantly blurred. It was a world where anything seemed possible, where unseen forces were always at play, and where the actions of individuals could have far-reaching consequences. This, my friend, is the world where witchcraft accusations would begin to take hold. It's essential to keep this atmosphere in mind as we delve deeper into the subject, because without understanding the pervasive nature of superstition, it's impossible to truly understand the fear and paranoia that fueled the witch hunts. It was a world primed to believe, a world ready to fear, and a world where the inexplicable could easily be attributed to the darkest of forces. So let us, with this understanding as our guide, continue our journey into the twilight of medieval witchcraft. All right, let's settle in and explore where these strange beliefs really started. Before we delve into the witch hunts themselves, it's crucial to understand the fertile ground from which the fear of witchcraft sprouted. Think of it like this. You can't understand a tree without knowing its roots, and the roots of medieval witchcraft beliefs run deep into both ancient pagan traditions and the evolving Christian worldview. Now, pagan is a broad term, isn't it? It basically encompasses the diverse array of pre-Christian religions and spiritual practices that thrived across Europe. These weren't some monolithic unified system. Instead, you had a patchwork of local customs, deities, and rituals deeply connected to the natural world. Think of the ancient Celts with their reverence for forests and sacred groves, the Norse with their pantheon of gods like Odin and Thor, and the various animistic beliefs that saw spirits inhabiting everything: trees, rivers, even rocks. Magic, in this pagan context, wasn't necessarily seen as evil. It was often a way to interact with the world, to influence events, or to seek healing. Village-wise women, for example, possessed knowledge of herbs and plants, using them to treat illnesses and ease childbirth. Charms and spells might be employed for protection, good fortune, or even to ensure a bountiful harvest. These practices were often interwoven with daily life, a natural part of the community's understanding of the world. But here's where things get interesting. As Christianity spread across Europe, it didn't entirely eradicate these older beliefs. Instead, there was a gradual process of assimilation and adaptation. Some pagan deities were reinterpreted as Christian saints, and certain rituals were incorporated into Christian festivals. Think of Yule logs becoming Christmas traditions, or spring festivals honoring fertility morphing into celebrations of Easter. However, this coexistence wasn't always peaceful. The Church naturally viewed paganism as a rival, a threat to its authority and the one true faith. Early Christian leaders often demonized pagan deities, portraying them as evil spirits or even manifestations of the devil. This created a powerful narrative that linked pre-Christian practices with demonic forces. Now, let's talk about early Christian views on magic itself. The Bible, while containing passages condemning certain forms of divination and sorcery, also acknowledges the existence of supernatural power. Think of the miracles performed by Jesus, or the stories of prophets wielding divine authority. This created a bit of a conundrum. How could Christians reconcile the idea of divinely sanctioned magic with the condemnation of other forms of supernatural intervention? The answer, largely, lay in intent and source. Miracles performed by God or his chosen representatives were seen as acts of divine grace, while magic practiced outside of the Christian framework was viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. If someone sought supernatural power through means other than prayer and devotion to God, it was assumed that they were drawing their power from a demonic source. Over time, this distinction became increasingly blurred. As the church consolidated its power, it began to exert more control over all aspects of life, including healing and divination. Practices that were once accepted, or at least tolerated, were now viewed with growing suspicion. The church became increasingly concerned with defining the boundaries of acceptable religious practice, and anything that fell outside those boundaries was deemed heretical, dangerous, and potentially demonic. Think about it from the perspective of someone living in the early Middle Ages. Life was precarious, filled with uncertainty. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. People desperately sought ways to control their environment, to protect themselves and their families. If traditional Christian prayers and rituals failed to bring the desired results, it's understandable that some might turn to other sources of help, even if those sources were viewed as suspect by the church. This created a climate of fear and suspicion. If your neighbor's crops flourished while yours failed, it was easy to suspect that they had used magic to steal your good fortune. If someone fell ill, it was tempting to blame a curse or a malevolent spell. And in a society where belief in the supernatural was widespread, these accusations could have devastating consequences. So to recap, the roots of medieval witchcraft beliefs are complex and multifaceted. They intertwine ancient pagan traditions with the evolving Christian worldview, creating a potent mixture of fear, superstition, and religious fervor. By demonizing pre-Christian practices and blurring the lines between acceptable and unacceptable magic, the church laid the groundwork for the witch hunts that would sweep across Europe in the centuries to come. Understanding these roots is absolutely essential to understanding the larger story of medieval witchcraft, because as we'll soon see, things are about to get a whole lot darker. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself. Because next we're going to delve into the document that truly codified the witch narrative, the Malleus Maleficarum. Alright, let's dim the lights a little more for this one. It's time we delve into a book. Not just any book, mind you, but arguably the most influential and terrifying text on witchcraft ever written. The Malleus Maleficarum. That's Latin, by the way, translating roughly to the hammer against witches. Doesn't exactly sound like a bedtime story, does it? But trust me, the historical impact of this book is something we really need to understand if we're going to understand the broader history of witchcraft accusations. So settle in, maybe grab another blanket, and let's gently swing this hammer, shall we? Now, the Malleus Maleficarum wasn't a lone wolf, howling in the wilderness of superstitious fear. It emerged from a particular historical context, the late 15th century. Think just after the invention of the printing press. This is a huge deal. Knowledge, or what passed for knowledge, was about to become much more accessible. But accessible doesn't necessarily mean accurate, or fair, or even sane. It just means, well, accessible. The book itself is usually attributed to two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer, also known as Henricus Instatorus, and Jacob Sprenger. Now Kramer, in particular, was a man on a mission. He'd been appointed as an inquisitor, basically a witch hunter, in the Holy Roman Empire, and he was frustrated. frustrated because, well, people weren't taking him seriously enough. Local authorities weren't always cooperating with his witch hunts. Some even doubted the reality of witchcraft itself. Imagine that. So Kramer, along with Sprenger, set out to write a definitive guide on witchcraft, a guide that would convince the skeptics, empower the inquisitors, and in their minds protect Christendom from the insidious threat of evil. This is what would become the Malleus Maleficarum, a book designed to be the witch hunter's Bible. Okay, so what's actually in this book? Well, it's divided into 3 parts, and each part is as unsettling as the last. Part 1 deals with the nature of witchcraft itself. It lays out the supposed evidence for the existence of witches, their powers, and their motivations. Now remember, this is the late 15th century. People's understanding of the world was, shall we say, a little different. Natural phenomena that we now understand through science were often attributed to supernatural causes. Illness, crop failure, storms, all potentially the work of witches in the minds of the Malleus authors. But what really sets the Malleus apart is its focus on the demonic pact. The idea that witches weren't just dabbling in harmless magic, but were actively in league with the devil. This pact, according to the Malleus, involved renouncing Christianity, paying homage to Satan, and engaging in all sorts of unspeakable acts, including, of course, sexual relations with demons. And this is where the Malleus really starts to get disturbing. The book is filled with graphic descriptions of demonic orgies, Sabbaths where witches supposedly gathered to worship the devil, and all sorts of other lurid details designed to titillate and terrify the reader in equal measure. It reads, in places, like a particularly nasty piece of medieval pornography, dressed up as religious instruction. Part 2 of the Malleus gets even more practical. It describes the methods witches supposedly used to inflict harm on others. This includes things like causing impotence, killing infants, and blighting crops. Again, the details are often graphic and disturbing, playing on people's deepest fears and anxieties. But perhaps the most insidious part of the Malleus is its detailed guide on how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches. It lays out the legal framework for witch trials, the types of evidence that should be considered admissible, and, crucially, the methods of torture that could be used to extract confessions. And this is where the Malleus truly becomes a hammer. A tool of oppression designed to crush the accused and extract confessions, regardless of their innocence or guilt. The book argues that because witchcraft was such a heinous crime, any means necessary could be used to uncover it. This included sleep deprivation, starvation, and of course the rack, a torture device that stretched the victim's limbs until they dislocated. The Malleus also emphasizes the importance of circumstantial evidence. Because witches were supposedly secretive and cunning, direct evidence of their crimes was often difficult to obtain. Therefore, things like rumors, accusations from neighbors, or even a simple reputation for being different could be used as evidence of guilt. And this brings us to perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Malleus Maleficarum, its misogyny. The book is deeply, profoundly sexist. It argues that women are inherently more susceptible to witchcraft than men. Why? Because they are weaker in faith, more carnal in their desires, and more easily deceived by the devil. I know it's absolutely infuriating to hear this stuff, but it's important to understand the deeply ingrained biases that fueled the witch hunts. The Malleus goes on to describe all sorts of supposed female weaknesses, portraying women as inherently deceitful, manipulative, and prone to fits of hysteria. It even suggests that women are naturally inclined to seek revenge for perceived slights, making them particularly susceptible to the devil's temptations. This misogynistic perspective is woven throughout the entire book. It shapes the way witches are portrayed, the types of crimes they are accused of, and the methods used to interrogate and punish them. It's a constant, insidious drumbeat that reinforces the idea that women are inherently dangerous and untrustworthy. The Malleus wasn't universally accepted by any means. Some theologians and legal scholars criticized its methods and its assumptions, but, crucially, the book gained the imprimatur of the Catholic Church, which meant it was seen as officially sanctioned, providing a powerful justification for witch hunts across Europe. And the printing press, remember? It helped to spread the Malleus far and wide. It was reprinted numerous times, translated into multiple languages, and became a standard reference for inquisitors, judges, and even ordinary people who were looking for guidance on how to identify and deal with witches. The book became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By defining what a witch was and how to find them, it helped to create the very phenomenon it claimed to be fighting. The Malleus Maleficarum didn't cause the witch hunts on its own, of course. There were many other factors at play, including social unrest, religious tensions, and economic anxieties. But the Malleus provided a framework for understanding witchcraft that was both terrifying and compelling. It gave witch hunters a sense of legitimacy, and it gave ordinary people a reason to fear their neighbors. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the Malleus Maleficarum, remember the hammer, and remember the importance of questioning authority, challenging assumptions, and resisting the temptation to demonize those who are different from us. Because sometimes the greatest dangers come not from witches in the woods, but from books on the shelf. Pleasant dreams, friends, and try not to let the demons bite. Okay, let's settle in now and delve into a rather unsettling aspect of the medieval witchcraft narrative: the disproportionate number of women accused. Why were women so overwhelmingly targeted? It's a complex question, one that doesn't lend itself to simple answers. It's a dance between societal structures, religious beliefs, and deeply ingrained fears. One of the most prominent factors was the prevailing view of women in medieval society. They were often seen as weaker, both physically and mentally, and therefore more susceptible to temptation by the devil. Think about it. The story of Adam and Eve was deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness. Eve, the first woman, was the one who succumbed to the serpent's lure, bringing sin into the world. This narrative cast a long shadow, associating women with inherent weakness and a propensity for evil. It wasn't necessarily that people thought women were inherently evil, just more easily swayed. This perception was further reinforced by the patriarchal structure of medieval society. Men held the positions of power, both in the church and in secular government. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, their roles defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, or widows. This lack of autonomy and influence made them vulnerable. They had less ability to defend themselves against accusations, and their voices were often silenced. Now, let's consider the types of women who were particularly at risk. Older women, especially widows, were often seen as suspect. Without a husband to protect them, they were more vulnerable to accusations, and their knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery sometimes made them targets. These skills, which were traditionally passed down through generations of women, were viewed with suspicion by a church increasingly focused on controlling knowledge and power. Imagine being a woman who always helped deliver babies in town and suddenly being accused of using dark magic. Midwives, in particular, were vulnerable. Childbirth was a dangerous process in the medieval period, with high rates of infant and maternal mortality. When things went wrong, it was easy to blame the midwife, accusing her of using magic to cause harm. After all, it was often knowledge passed down through families, not always approved or understood by the medical and religious leaders. It's also worth pointing out here that with the rise of male physicians, the role of women as healers was being systematically diminished, making female knowledge even more suspect in some circles. Another group at risk were women who deviated from societal norms. Those who were assertive, independent, or outspoken were often seen as challenging the established order and were therefore more likely to be accused of witchcraft. Their non-conformity was interpreted as a sign of rebellion, and their perceived defiance of male authority was seen as evidence of their alliance with the devil. It's really awful when you think about it. Women who went against the grain were more at risk because they were already seen as rebellious. Furthermore, the association of women with the body and sexuality played a significant role. Medieval theologians often linked women with lust and temptation, viewing them as inherently carnal beings. This association made them prime suspects for engaging in sexual acts with the devil, a common accusation in witchcraft trials. The Malleus Maleficarum, that famous hammer against witches we talked about, explicitly stated that women were more prone to carnal lust, making them more susceptible to demonic influence. It's a rather terrible read, to be honest. Economic factors also played a role. In times of hardship, accusations of witchcraft often served as a way to scapegoat vulnerable members of society. Women, particularly those who were poor or marginalized, were easy targets. Accusations of witchcraft could be used to settle personal scores, seize property, or eliminate rivals. It was, in some ways, a convenient way to get rid of someone who was inconvenient. And then there's the matter of fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the natural world, fear of female power. Witchcraft beliefs provided a framework for understanding and controlling these fears. By identifying and persecuting witches, society could attempt to restore order and maintain control. It was a way of projecting anxieties onto a tangible enemy. It's important to remember that not all women accused of witchcraft were actually guilty of anything. The vast majority were victims of circumstance, targeted because of their gender, their social status, or their perceived deviance from societal norms. It's also important not to dismiss the genuine belief in witchcraft that existed in the medieval period. People truly believed that witches had the power to harm others, and they were genuinely afraid. But this fear was often fueled by misogyny and a desire to control women. So to summarize, the disproportionate number of women accused of witchcraft was a result of a complex interplay of factors: the prevailing view of women as weaker and more susceptible to temptation, the patriarchal structure of medieval society, the association of women with the body and sexuality, economic factors, and the fear of female power. It's a dark chapter in history, a reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of challenging societal norms that perpetuate inequality. And also, it's really important to keep in mind that while people believed magic was real, that doesn't mean all of the women accused were witches. Many were likely innocent and only being scapegoated. Alright, settle in a bit closer, let your eyes get heavy. We're going to delve into something a little less pleasant, but essential to understanding the witch hunts. The accusation. How did a simple dispute, a neighborly disagreement, spiral into something so horrific? It's all quite human really, and that's perhaps the scariest part. Imagine a small medieval village, nestled amongst rolling hills. Life is hard, really hard. The weather is unpredictable. Harvests are often meager. Disease is just a constant companion. There's a deep sense of vulnerability, a feeling that forces beyond your control are constantly at play. Superstition thrives in this kind of environment, doesn't it? Now, picture two women, maybe living next door to each other. Let's call them Agnes and Alara. Agnes has a cow, a prized possession providing milk for her family. Alara's garden isn't doing so well this year. Maybe her chickens are sickly. Life isn't easy on her either. One day, Agnes' cow suddenly stops giving milk. Just stops. Agnes is devastated. This could mean hunger for her family, maybe even worse. She looks for a cause, a reason. She sees Alara in her garden, tending to her struggling plants. Maybe Alara looked at the cow funny that morning. Maybe Agnes remembers a time when Alara asked to borrow some milk, and Agnes refused. A seed of suspicion begins to sprout. This is where things get interesting. In a world where natural explanations are limited, people often turn to supernatural ones. The idea of witchcraft, of someone possessing the ability to influence events through magic, was deeply ingrained. So Agnes starts to wonder, did Alara curse her cow? It sounds ridiculous to us now, doesn't it? But put yourself in Agnes' shoes, desperate, fearful, and lacking any real understanding of biology or animal husbandry. Witchcraft becomes a plausible explanation, a whispered rumor, a shared glance with another villager, and suddenly the suspicion takes root in the community. Now, let's add another layer. Maybe Agnes and Alara had a pre-existing feud. Perhaps they'd argued over property lines or gossip or some long-forgotten slight. These existing tensions provide fertile ground for the accusation to grow. It's not just about the cow anymore. It's about resentment, about power dynamics, about years of simmering disagreements. The accusation doesn't happen in a vacuum. There might be a local wise woman, a healer who uses herbs and traditional remedies. She might be seen as competition by some, a threat to the established order. Perhaps she's angered a powerful man in the village. Accusations of witchcraft can become a way to silence dissent, to eliminate rivals, to settle scores. And once the accusation is out there, it's incredibly difficult to retract. Fear spreads through the community like wildfire. People start remembering odd things about Alara, the way she keeps to herself, the strange herbs she grows, the black cat that always seems to be lurking around her house. Each observation, no matter how innocent, is reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. It's a perfect storm of fear, superstition, and social tensions. The simple dispute over a cow, the failing garden, the long-standing feud, they all combine to create a narrative, a story that paints Alara as a witch. And once that narrative takes hold, it's incredibly difficult to break free from. The community starts to ostracize Alara. They avoid her. They whisper behind her back. They might even start accusing her of other things, causing illness, ruining crops, bringing bad luck. She becomes the scapegoat for all the village's misfortunes. This is also where gender plays a significant role. Remember, women were often seen as more susceptible to the devil's influence, more prone to sin. This pre-existing bias made it easier to believe that Alara, a woman, would be capable of witchcraft. The accusation isn't always a formal legal process. It often starts informally, through gossip and rumor, but eventually it might reach the attention of the local authorities, the village priest, the lord of the manor, or even a traveling judge. These figures, often influenced by the prevailing beliefs and anxieties of the time, might decide to investigate further, and that's when things get truly dangerous. Because once the authorities are involved, the accusation can quickly escalate into a full-blown witch hunt. What began as a simple dispute over a cow can end in imprisonment, torture, and even death. It's a horrifying illustration of how easily fear and suspicion can corrupt a community, turning neighbor against neighbor. How slumberous it can be to sit around the campfire and listen to folklore and rumors. How easy is it to gossip, to pass words around in a circle, and to believe such falsities? How scary is it to know that anyone could accuse you and be believed? That's the real, uncomfortable truth about the accusation. It's often rooted in the most ordinary, the most human of circumstances, and that perhaps is why it's so chilling, and why this will be a lovely story to fall asleep to. It's also worth considering the role of folklore and storytelling. Tales of witches and magical creatures have been around for centuries, and animals often feature prominently in these stories. Over time, these stories became intertwined with the witch hunts, blurring the line between fact and fiction. Now, what's really important to remember is that the vast majority of people accused of witchcraft were not actually practicing any kind of magic. They were ordinary people, often women, who were caught up in a wave of fear and paranoia. And the idea of the familiar was just one more piece of evidence used against them. Imagine being accused of witchcraft. You're already terrified, possibly being tortured. And then someone asks you about your pet cat. You might say, "Oh yes, that's Mittens. She's a good cat." But under duress, that statement could be twisted into something far more sinister. So you admit you have a familiar, a demonic entity that serves your evil purposes. Many confessions included detailed descriptions of familiars, their names, their habits, and the ways they helped the witch carry out her dark deeds. Some familiars even had rather comical names like Pyewacket, Greedigut, and Rifler. However, it's crucial to remember that these confessions were often extracted through torture or coercion. People were saying whatever they thought the authorities wanted to hear in order to end the pain and suffering. The myth of the familiar is a sad example of how fear and superstition can distort reality. It's a reminder that even the most innocent things, like an animal companion, can become weapons in the hands of those who are driven by prejudice and paranoia. So the next time you see a picture of a witch with her trusty black cat, remember the real story behind that image. It's a story not of magic and power, but of fear, misunderstanding, and injustice. A chilling tale best left to the history books and not repeated. All right, settle in and let's drift into the hushed world of medieval herbalism and how it became something to fear. Imagine a time long before pharmacies, before doctors were commonplace, especially in rural areas. For most folks in the medieval world, their first and often only line of defense against illness was the knowledge and skill of local healers. And more often than not, those healers were women. These women, and sometimes men, held a deep understanding of the natural world. They knew which plants could soothe a fever, which could staunch bleeding, which could ease the pains of childbirth. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, a whispered legacy of trial and error, careful observation, and a genuine connection with the land. Think of the herbs we still use today: lavender for relaxation, chamomile for sleep, sage for, well, everything really. Now amplify that knowledge, because these weren't just comforting teas. These were potent remedies crafted from ingredients grown in their own gardens or foraged from the nearby forests. They created poultices from comfrey to heal broken bones, a surprisingly effective remedy, even by today's standards. They brewed teas from willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They understood the properties of foxglove, carefully using its extracts to treat heart conditions, though, admittedly, the dosage was tricky and mistakes could be, well, let's just say permanent. This wasn't just about treating illness either. It was about preventative care, about maintaining balance within the body and with the environment. It was a holistic approach to health, a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of things. So where does the suspicion come in, you ask? Well, several factors started to muddy the waters. Firstly, there's the inherent mystery of it all. To the average person, watching a healer gather herbs, mutter incantations, which were often just prayers or traditional rhymes, and brew a potion, it looked like magic. And in a world steeped in superstition, where the lines between the natural and supernatural were blurred, that perception could be dangerous. Secondly, the church, with its growing power and influence, began to view these practices with increasing unease. Now, it's important to remember that the church itself had a long tradition of herbalism and healing within its monasteries. Monks and nuns meticulously cultivated medicinal gardens and created remedies for their communities. However, the church's concern stemmed from control. They believed that healing should ultimately come from God through prayer and faith. The independent knowledge and practices of these local healers, particularly when combined with elements of pre-Christian traditions, were seen as a potential threat to their authority. Think about it. If someone could heal themselves or their community using natural remedies, what need did they have for the church? And perhaps more importantly, what tithes would go uncollected? Then there's the gendered aspect of it all. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of these healers were women, and in a patriarchal society, women who possessed knowledge and independence were often viewed with suspicion and mistrust. Remember, this was a time when women were largely excluded from formal education and public life. Their roles were primarily confined to the domestic sphere. So a woman who possessed specialized knowledge, who could command respect and influence within her community, who wasn't beholden to a male figure, that was a deviation from the established norm, and anything that deviated from the norm was, well, suspect. Furthermore, the rise of formal medicine, albeit in its very early stages, contributed to the growing suspicion. As universities began to establish medical schools and train physicians, primarily men, they sought to legitimize their profession and distance themselves from what they perceived as the unscientific practices of folk healers. These university-trained doctors often dismissed the knowledge of herbalists as mere superstition, lacking any real basis in reason or evidence. And while some of their criticisms might have been valid, let's be honest, some folk remedies were pretty outlandish. They also served to undermine the authority and credibility of these local healers. So you have a confluence of factors: the inherent mystery of herbalism, the church's desire for control, societal misogyny, and the rise of formal medicine. All of these things contributed to a growing sense of unease and suspicion surrounding the practice of herbalism, particularly when practiced by women. Slowly, subtly, the image of the wise woman, the healer, the community caregiver, began to morph into something far more sinister: the witch. The knowledge that had once been a source of comfort and healing became a source of fear and accusation. The plants that had once been used to mend bodies and soothe souls became tools of darkness and instruments of evil. And that, my friends, is how knowledge in the wrong time and place can become something truly boring. Alright, settle in a little deeper. Let's talk about something that really stirred up fear and suspicion back in medieval times: the Devil's Mark. Imagine living back then. You're already surrounded by all sorts of beliefs about the unseen. Now imagine someone pointing at a birthmark, a mole, or even just a bit of insensitive skin on you and saying that's where the devil touched you. Chilling, right? The idea behind the Devil's Mark, sometimes called a witch's teat, was that when a person made a pact with the devil, he would leave a physical stamp on their body. It was like a gruesome branding, a visible sign of their allegiance to evil. This mark wasn't just any old blemish, though. It was believed to be insensitive to pain, a spot where the devil had sucked blood, or perhaps sealed the deal with a kiss. And this is where it gets truly unsettling, because who got to decide what qualified as a devil's mark? Well, that would be the witch hunters. These were often men, sometimes self-proclaimed experts, who would examine accused witches with meticulous detail. They'd shave every inch of their body. Yes, every inch, searching for any irregularity that could be construed as evidence. Think about the violation of that, the dehumanization. The process itself was excruciating and humiliating. The accused, usually a woman, would be stripped naked, often in front of a crowd. Her body would be poked, prodded, and examined for any unusual marks. Remember, beauty standards were different, medical knowledge was limited, and everyone has some sort of imperfection, right? But to a witch hunter, armed with his beliefs and biases, almost anything could become damning evidence. Sometimes they would use needles, sticking them into the suspect area repeatedly to see if it caused pain or bled. If the person didn't react, or if the mark didn't bleed, well, that was it. Proof of a pact with the devil. But even if they did react, and it did bleed, it didn't mean they were off the hook, because the hunters could then claim that the devil had simply made the mark look insensitive to try and trick them. It's a truly maddening no-win situation for the accused. Of course, the reality is far more mundane. Birthmarks are common, scars happen, skin tags develop, and even insensitivity to pain can be explained by nerve damage or variations in skin thickness. But in the context of the witch hunts, these natural variations were twisted and weaponized, used to condemn innocent people. And the witch's teat, well, that was often interpreted as a mole or skin tag, or even an extra nipple. The belief was that these teats were used to suckle familiars, those demonic animal companions we talked about earlier, giving them sustenance. The presence of such a teat was considered particularly damning. Now imagine the power this gave to accusers. Maybe you had a feud with your neighbor. Maybe you were jealous of someone's beauty, or maybe you simply didn't like someone's personality. All it took was a whisper, a suggestion that they might be a witch, and suddenly they could be subjected to this horrifying examination. The Devil's Mark wasn't just about physical proof. It was about control. It was about stripping away a person's dignity, reducing them to a body to be scrutinized and judged. It was about instilling fear and paranoia in the community, making everyone suspicious of their neighbors. It became a terrifying method of social control. It's important to remember that these examinations weren't conducted by objective, scientific observers. They were driven by deeply held beliefs, often fueled by misogyny and social anxieties. The evidence they found was a reflection of their own biases, not a reflection of reality. The obsession with the devil's mark highlights the absurd lengths to which people would go to justify their beliefs about witchcraft. It also underscores the vulnerability of the accused, stripped of their rights and subjected to the whims of their accusers. It's truly horrifying to think about. And the real tragedy, of course, is that behind every devil's mark, behind every accusation, there was a real person. A person with hopes, dreams, and fears, whose life was irrevocably destroyed by these baseless beliefs. It's a chilling reminder of the power of fear and the importance of critical thinking, isn't it? Okay, let's take a nice deep breath and move on from that darkness. There are sunnier, sleepy fields ahead. Okay, let's drift off into the realm of Sabbath rituals. The very idea conjures up images, doesn't it? Dancing around bonfires, maybe some chanting, perhaps even a little bit of, well, you know, the stuff that got people really worried back in the Middle Ages. But how much of that was fact? How much was pure, unadulterated fiction? And what role did, shall we say, collective hysteria play in all of this? The Sabbath, in the context of medieval witchcraft beliefs, wasn't just any old get-together, it was the gathering. The supposed meeting place for witches where they'd convene with each other, with demons, and even, according to some accounts, with the devil himself. Think of it as the witchy equivalent of a really intense annual company retreat. Except, instead of team-building exercises, well, let's just say the activities were a little more controversial. Now, what were these alleged activities? Well, that's where things get interesting, because the descriptions vary wildly. Some accounts, often gleaned from the enthusiastic testimonies of accused witches under torture, painted a picture of absolute depravity. Think orgies, cannibalism, especially of infants, shudder, the desecration of Christian symbols, and the signing of pacts with the devil, often in exchange for magical powers. It's all incredibly graphic, and to be honest, pretty shocking, like something straight out of a horror movie. Other accounts, however, are a little less theatrical. They describe more mundane gatherings involving dancing, feasting, and simple acts of divination or magic. Perhaps a little less satanic panic and a little more Wiccan potluck. It really depends on who's telling the story. So what's the truth? Well, let's be honest here. There's very little evidence that these large-scale ritualistic Sabbath gatherings ever actually happened. I mean, think about it. Organizing something like that in the Middle Ages, when travel was difficult, communication was unreliable, and suspicion was rife, it would have been a logistical nightmare and a security risk of epic proportions. What's far more likely is that these accounts were a mixture of a few things: genuine folk beliefs, distorted by fear and superstition, forced confessions extracted under torture, designed to confirm pre-existing biases, and perhaps most importantly, good old-fashioned rumor and gossip, amplified by the anxieties of the time. Think about it. Imagine a small village, rife with tension and suspicion. Someone accuses someone else of witchcraft. The authorities start asking questions. The accused, terrified and desperate, starts making things up, trying to tell the authorities what they think they want to hear. They might have heard whispers of Sabbath rituals, distorted versions of pagan celebrations, or even just misinterpreted dreams and nightmares. And so, the legend grows, fueled by fear and paranoia. And that, my friends, is where collective hysteria comes in. It's a fascinating phenomenon, isn't it? How a group of people can, under the influence of fear, anxiety, and suggestion, start to believe in things that are demonstrably untrue. It's like a virus, spreading from person to person, infecting minds with suspicion and paranoia. One person sees a shadow in the woods and thinks it's a demon. They tell someone else. That person, already anxious, sees the same shadow and knows it's a demon. They tell someone else, and before you know it, the whole village is convinced that the woods are infested with demons, even though it's probably just a particularly gnarly-looking tree. In the context of the witch hunts, collective hysteria played a huge role. It allowed people to believe in the most outlandish accusations, to see evidence of witchcraft where none existed, and to turn on their neighbors with terrifying speed. It created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, where anyone could be accused, and where the slightest deviation from social norms could be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The idea of the Sabbat, with its lurid descriptions of orgies, cannibalism and devil worship, perfectly encapsulated those fears. It provided a convenient scapegoat for all the anxieties and uncertainties of the time. Crop failures. The Sabbat did it. Disease outbreaks. The Sabbat did it. Unexplained accidents. You guessed it. The Sabbat did it. It's important to remember, though, that even if these large-scale Sabbat rituals were largely a figment of the collective imagination, that doesn't mean that everyone accused of witchcraft was innocent of everything. Some people genuinely believed in magic, practiced folk traditions, or even dabbled in herbal remedies that were misunderstood or misinterpreted. But the image of the Sabbat, as it was presented in the witch trials, was more of a reflection of society's fears and anxieties than a true depiction of actual practices. So next time you hear about witches dancing naked under the moonlight, sacrificing babies to the devil, remember to take it with a very large pinch of salt. Because the truth, as always, is far more complex and far more nuanced than the legends would have you believe. It's a story of fear, superstition, and the terrifying power of collective hysteria. A story that reminds us that even the most outlandish beliefs can take hold when fear is allowed to run rampant and reason takes a back seat. And that, my friends, is a truly chilling thought. Now, let's try to sleep on that. All right, settle in, because we're about to delve into the world of those who hunted witches. Now, you might think this was a disorganized, knee-jerk reaction to widespread fear, and in some cases it was. But increasingly across Europe, especially during the peak of the witch hunts, professional witch hunters emerged, and they weren't just some folks with pitchforks and torches. Think of them as consultants, grim consultants. They were employed by towns, cities, even entire regions to identify, interrogate, and ultimately eliminate the perceived threat of witchcraft. These weren't always religious figures, though some certainly were. Many were legal scholars, men almost exclusively men, with a keen understanding of the law, and a perhaps even keener understanding of how to bend it. Now, their methods were, shall we say, varied, and frankly horrifying. But understanding them is crucial to understanding the scale and the impact of the witch hunts. One of the most common techniques involved, well, accusation. A witch hunter would often start with a small village, a place ripe with suspicion and pre-existing grudges. They'd begin by interviewing locals, often focusing on those already suspected of eccentric behavior. Maybe someone who talked to their cat a little too much, or an elderly woman who lived alone and knew a bit about herbs. These became prime targets. And the questions, oh the questions, they weren't about, evidence. They were about suggestion, leading questions. Things like, have you ever felt a strange power around Goody Osler? Or have you ever seen her talking to animals in the woods? The aim wasn't to find truth, but to plant seeds of doubt and suspicion in the minds of others. Once a few names were in the mix, things could escalate quickly. Accusations often triggered a chain reaction. Someone accused under duress, or simply out of fear, would name others, and those others would name still more. It was a snowball effect, a terrifying spiral of paranoia and betrayal. But accusation was only the beginning. Then came the investigation. And this is where things got truly nasty. Witch hunters employed a range of tests to determine guilt or innocence. These were often based on superstition, or, let's just say, creative interpretations of religious texts. One of the most infamous was the swimming test. The accused would be bound, often with their right thumb tied to their left big toe, and thrown into a body of water. The logic, such as it was that pure water would reject a witch. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, well, they might be innocent, but they were also probably dead. So, a bit of a lose-lose situation. Then there was the pricking or probing. Witch hunters believed that witches bore the devil's mark, an insensitive spot on their body where they were suckled by demons. To find this mark, they would systematically probe the accused's body with needles, looking for an area that didn't bleed or feel pain. Of course, these prickers often used retractable needles or sleight of hand to create the illusion of a devil's mark. A tiny pinprick could be dismissed. A long bout of prodding that showed no blood, that was damning evidence. Sleep deprivation was another favorite. The accused would be kept awake for days, even weeks at a time. Exhausted, disoriented, and vulnerable, they were far more likely to confess to anything just to make the torment stop. And then, of course, there was torture. We'll go into more detail about this later, but suffice it to say that torture was a common tool used to extract confessions. The rack, thumb screws, the strappado being hoisted by the arms and dropped. These weren't just medieval implements of pain, they were instruments of psychological manipulation designed to break the will of the accused. It's important to remember that these witch hunters were often paid based on the number of witches they discovered. This created a powerful incentive to find guilt, even if it meant fabricating evidence or coercing confessions. The more witches they found, the more money they made, a truly disgusting incentive structure. Some witch hunters were undoubtedly true believers, convinced they were doing God's work by ridding the world of evil, but others were, well, they were essentially con artists, preying on fear and superstition for personal gain. They traveled from town to town, offering their services, stirring up paranoia, and leaving behind a trail of ruined lives. One particularly notorious example was Matthias Rembold, who during the late 16th century terrorized parts of southern Germany. He presented himself as an expert in detecting witches, and through a combination of intimidation, leading questions, and outright torture, he was responsible for the deaths of dozens of innocent people. He wasn't a religious figure, he was just a man who saw an opportunity to exploit the fear of others. The methods of these witch hunters spread across Europe through printed materials, through word of mouth, and through the very trials they conducted. The Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hunting manual, became a sort of how-to guide for aspiring witch hunters, outlining the supposed characteristics of witches, the methods of interrogation, and the justifications for torture. These witch hunters weren't just individuals, they were part of a system fueled by fear, superstition, and a deep-seated belief in the power of evil. And it's a system that sadly claimed the lives of thousands upon thousands of innocent people. It's a dark chapter in human history, and one that we must never forget, because understanding how these witch hunts happened, how fear and paranoia could be so easily manipulated, can help us to prevent similar atrocities from happening again. Alright, settle in friends, because now we're going to look at how these witchcraft beliefs weren't just floating around in a vacuum, they landed differently depending on where you were in Europe. Think of it like pizza. Same basic ingredients, but Naples makes it one way, New York another, and Chicago, well, Chicago does its own thing, doesn't it? So let's hop around the continent, shall we? Starting perhaps in the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, messy collection of principalities, free cities, and bishoprics. Think of it like a medieval version of a complicated board game. In places like Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Austria, the witch trials were often very intense, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum, which we talked about before, that Hammer Against Witches book, it was hugely influential here. It provided a framework, a checklist almost, for identifying, prosecuting, and sadly executing suspected witches. Now, the trials weren't uniform. Some regions were far more zealous than others. For example, the Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg in Germany was notorious. Under the rule of Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim, it became a veritable witch-hunting machine. Dozens, maybe even hundreds, were burned at the stake, Property was confiscated, families were ruined. It was a truly dark chapter. Other parts of the empire, though, were relatively quiet. It really depended on the local ruler, the local courts, and the prevailing social anxieties. Next, let's gently drift over to France. The French experience was, in some ways, a bit more regulated. They had the Parliament courts. These were regional high courts, and they tended to be a bit more skeptical than some of their German counterparts. Sure, there were witch trials, especially in regions like Lorraine and Normandy, but the Parliament often reviewed the cases and sometimes overturned convictions. Torture was still used, sadly, but it wasn't always as excessive or as readily accepted as in some other areas. One thing that's interesting about France is the emphasis on maleficia, that is, the harmful magic that witches were believed to inflict on their neighbors. Things like blighting crops, causing illness, or making animals barren. These were the kinds of accusations that often surfaced. Now, let's cross the English Channel to the British Isles. England, Scotland, and Ireland, three distinct places with their own witchcraft narratives. England, compared to Scotland, had relatively fewer executions. English witchcraft beliefs often centered on maleficia too, the causing of harm. But the legal system was a bit different. English law required more concrete evidence than in some continental trials, which, while still awful, offered slightly better chances for the accused. Scotland was a different beast entirely. The Scottish witch hunts were particularly intense, especially in the late 16th and 17th centuries. King James VI of Scotland, later James V, was a firm believer in witchcraft, and he actively encouraged the prosecution of suspected witches. The North Berwick witch trials, which he was personally involved in, are a prime example. They involved accusations of plotting to sink the king's ship using magic. Talk about high stakes. Scottish witchcraft beliefs also had a stronger emphasis on the Sabbat, the alleged gatherings of witches where they supposedly met with the devil. Ireland, sadly, had fewer recorded witch trials compared to England and Scotland. It's not that witchcraft beliefs weren't present, but the social and political context was different. The English colonial presence, the ongoing conflicts, and the different legal systems all played a role in shaping the witchcraft narrative there. Let's float down to Spain and Italy now. In Spain, the Spanish Inquisition played a significant role in witchcraft trials, but interestingly, the Inquisition was often more concerned with heresy, that is, deviations from Catholic doctrine, than with simple maleficia. The Basque witch trials of the early 17th century are a notable exception, a period of intense witch hunting in the Basque region of Spain. Italy, like the Holy Roman Empire, was a patchwork of different states and regions. The Roman Inquisition, based in Rome, had jurisdiction over a large area, and it too was primarily focused on heresy. However, local courts and secular authorities also conducted witch trials. Beliefs about the evil eye, the ability to inflict harm with a glance, were particularly prevalent in Italy, and this sometimes factored into witchcraft accusations. And finally, let's gently glide up to Scandinavia. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway each had their own witch trials, although they tended to be somewhat later than in other parts of Europe, peaking in the late 17th century. Swedish witch trials, for example, often involved accusations of children being taken to the Blockula, a mythical island where witches were said to meet with the devil. These trials often involved vivid descriptions of these alleged gatherings, fueled perhaps by folklore and social anxieties. So, as we've seen, witchcraft beliefs and witch trials varied quite a bit across Europe. Local customs, legal systems, religious authorities, and social anxieties all shaped the way witchcraft was understood and prosecuted in different regions. It wasn't a single unified phenomenon, but rather a complex tapestry of beliefs and practices that reflected the diverse cultures and histories of the continent. It's a fascinating and rather sad part of European history to ponder, isn't it? Alright, take a nice deep breath now. Almost there. Alright, Settle in, friends. Let's talk about how the big witch hunts actually started to slow down. It wasn't one single thing, but more like a bunch of little pebbles that eventually caused an avalanche of doubt. One of the biggest factors, well, it was starting to become pretty clear that the trials themselves weren't exactly fair. Think about it. You have folks being accused based on sometimes not much more than a neighborly spat, or maybe someone just didn't like the way you looked. And then once you were accused, good luck proving your innocence. The system was kind of rigged against you from the start, wasn't it? Torture, in particular, started raising some eyebrows. You see, confessions were huge in these trials. It was like, aha, we got 'em. They confessed. But how reliable is a confession when it's been squeezed out of someone using sleep deprivation, thumbscrews, or even worse? People will say anything to make the pain stop. And slowly, people were starting to ask, wait a minute, are these confessions actually true, or are they just trauma responses? Plus, the sheer number of people being accused and executed started to become disturbing, particularly as some scholars, theologians, and even regular everyday people started to realize that the type of person being accused didn't really add up. It wasn't just those thought to be evildoers that were being accused, but rather many were poor, elderly, mentally ill, or basically just a bit different. These weren't the diabolical masterminds orchestrating evil, but rather the vulnerable in society, and that started sitting wrong with a lot of folks. Then you have the rise of what we might call early science. Now, I don't mean beakers and Bunsen burners everywhere, but a shift toward a more rational way of thinking. The Renaissance had been chugging along, and people were starting to question things. They were looking for natural explanations, not just supernatural ones. So when someone's cow got sick, they might start thinking about contaminated water or poor feed rather than immediately jumping to witchcraft. This kind of critical thinking trickled down, making some people skeptical. And this skepticism also came from within the legal and medical communities. Doctors, seeing the bizarre symptoms supposedly caused by witches, started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, some of these folks were just sick. Maybe they had epilepsy or some other kind of undiagnosed illness. And lawyers, well, some of them started noticing the flaws in the evidence, the inconsistencies in the testimonies, the general lack of actual proof. Now, this wasn't a complete about-face, of course. Superstition was still running rampant, but a few brave souls were starting to speak out. They wrote books, they gave sermons, they argued in court, and they risked a lot to do it. These weren't always grand pronouncements, but more like quiet, persistent whispers of dissent that grew louder over time. Another important thing, the trials were expensive. Running these investigations, housing the accused, paying the witch hunters, and then the executions. It added up. And some towns, especially after a particularly zealous witch hunt, found themselves pretty much broke. Suddenly the cost-benefit analysis of chasing witches just didn't seem so appealing anymore, especially if there was potential for a witch to just be sickly, as many were. And let's not forget the impact these trials had on communities. Imagine the constant fear, the paranoia, the distrust, neighbors turning on neighbors, families torn apart. It created a climate of terror, and eventually, people got tired of it. They wanted to go back to some sense of normalcy. They wanted to trust their neighbors again, to feel safe in their own homes. The political landscape also played a role. As central governments got stronger, they started to exert more control over local courts. And some rulers, for purely pragmatic reasons, started to see witch hunts as destabilizing. They didn't necessarily disbelieve in witchcraft, but they were more concerned with maintaining order and consolidating power. Widespread panic about witches wasn't exactly conducive to that. Now, none of these factors acted alone. It was the combination of unfair trials, torture-induced confessions, questioning voices, financial strain, community disruption, and political considerations that led to a gradual erosion of belief in witchcraft as an immediate, widespread problem. And it's important to remember that this decline wasn't uniform. Some regions clung to witch hunts longer than others, but the seeds of doubt had been sown, and eventually they grew into a widespread skepticism that changed the course of history. She's sleepy time. All right, settle in everyone. Let's drift off into some actual history now, shall we? We've talked about the beliefs, the accusations, and the hunts themselves. Now let's look at some specific trials, some names and places you might recognize. And don't worry, I'll keep it nice and mellow, just the way we like it. Of course, no discussion of witch trials is complete without mentioning Salem. The Salem witch trials in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were a dark period from 1692 to 1693. It began with a group of young women who started having fits and accusing several local women of witchcraft. Now, these weren't just whispers, these were public accusations, and in a community already steeped in religious fervor and fear of the devil, it didn't take much for the flames to ignite. The trials themselves were, well, they were a mess. Evidence was often based on spectral evidence, that is, visions or dreams, that the accusers claimed were sent to them by the accused witches. Can you imagine? You could be condemned based on someone's dream about you. It was truly a recipe for disaster. People weren't thinking clearly. Fear had taken over, and these accusations had devastating consequences. Over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft. 30 were found guilty, 19 of whom were executed by hanging. Others died in prison, waiting for their trials. It was a chaotic, terrifying time. Now, the Salem trials eventually ended. The hysteria died down. People started to question the validity of the evidence, and in 1697, the Massachusetts General Court formally apologized for the injustices that had occurred. Restitution was eventually paid to the families of the victims, but the scar remained. The Salem witch trials serve as a powerful reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and the importance of due process. Now let's journey across the Atlantic to another infamous case, the Pendle witch trials. These took place in Lancashire, England, in 1612. This area was known for being a little isolated, let's say. There were a lot of superstitions, a lot of poverty, and a general distrust of outsiders, all the ingredients for a good old witch hunt, really. The Pendle trials centered around two rival families, the Demdike and Chattox families, both of whom were rumored to practice magic. They were basically in a turf war over who could provide the best spells, if you can believe it. It all started when a peddler, John Law, claimed that Eliza Device, a member of the Demdike family, had cursed him after he refused to give her some pins. Pins, a tiny little request. But the perceived slight led to accusations of witchcraft, and soon, other members of both families were implicated. The trials were overseen by a local magistrate named Thomas Covell. He was convinced that these people were genuine threats to society. The evidence presented was questionable, to say the least. Much of it came from Janet Device, Eliza's younger sister, who was only 9 years old. She testified against her own family, claiming to have witnessed them performing all sorts of dark magic. Can you imagine a child having that kind of power over their family's lives? It's truly terrible. As a result of Janet's testimony, 10 people were found guilty and hanged at Lancaster Castle. The Pendle witch trials are significant because they provide a detailed look into the social and economic tensions that often fueled witchcraft accusations. They also highlight the role of children in these trials and the devastating impact their testimony could have, even when coerced or fabricated. Okay, let's talk about something a little less well known now. The North Berwick witch trials in Scotland. These took place in the 1590s and involved a large number of people accused of plotting against King James VI, who later became King James I of England. Now, King James was a firm believer in witchcraft. He even wrote a book about it, called Daemonology. So, when rumors started circulating about a coven of witches plotting to sink his ship during a voyage from Denmark, he took it very seriously. The trials were intense. Many of the accused were tortured into confessing to all sorts of outlandish acts. They confessed to meeting with the devil, casting spells to create storms, and even attempting to poison the king himself. It was all very dramatic and most likely completely fabricated under duress. One of the most famous figures in the North Berwick trials was Agnes Sampson, a local healer and midwife. She was accused of being the leader of the coven and subjected to horrific torture, including sleep deprivation, having her head shaved, and being bound with cords. Eventually, she confessed to everything, confirming the king's suspicions. The North Berwick trials are significant because they demonstrate the role of political paranoia in fueling witch hunts. King James's personal beliefs and fears played a major role in these trials. They also show how torture could be used to extract confessions even from innocent people. The trials were a dark chapter in Scottish history, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and religious zealotry. These are just a few examples, of course. Witch trials took place all over Europe and in the Americas, each with its own unique characteristics and circumstances. But they all shared common threads: fear, superstition, social tensions, and a willingness to believe the worst about those who were different or misunderstood. And that, my friends, is a chilling thought to drift off to, isn't it? Let it settle in. Let it make you think. And then let it fade away as you drift off to sleep, knowing that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and hopefully never repeat them. Good night. Alright, let's gently ease into the stories of those accused of witchcraft and the communities that were forever changed by these events. It's important to remember that behind the sensational trials and lurid accusations were real people, often ordinary individuals caught in a web of fear and suspicion. Their experiences offer a more human and heartbreaking perspective on the era of witch hunts. Take the story of Isabel Gowdy, for example. Isabel lived in Scotland in the 17th century and stands out because of the sheer volume of detailed confessions she gave. Now, confession is putting it lightly. These were extracted through intense questioning and likely involved sleep deprivation and psychological manipulation. She confessed to meeting with the devil, shape-shifting, and participating in elaborate sabbats. She even described incantations and rituals in vivid detail. Now, most historians agree that Isabel's confessions were likely a product of her imagination, perhaps fueled by folklore, anxiety, or a desire to escape a difficult life. What's particularly poignant is the context of her community. Isabel lived in a rural area where life was hard, resources were scarce, and superstition was rampant. Her detailed accounts, whether true or false, would have undoubtedly sent shockwaves through her village, creating a climate of fear and paranoia. The very act of her accusations, even if coerced, likely fractured the bonds of trust within the community, leaving lasting scars. Then there's the case of Gellis Duncan. Gellis was a young servant in Scotland in the late 16th century. Her story is significant because it was one of the first major witch trials of the Scottish witch hunt period. Her employer, David Seaton, became suspicious of her after noticing her secretive behavior, apparent healing abilities, and uncanny knowledge of illnesses. He began to torture her, and under duress, she confessed to witchcraft, accusing others in the process. Gellis's story illustrates how easily suspicion could arise from a simple misunderstanding. Her knowledge of herbal remedies, something that might have been valued in another time, was twisted into evidence of a pact with the devil. The fear that drove Seaton to torture her underscores the climate of distrust that pervaded the era. What happened to Gellis after her initial confession is she was further tortured and forced to name other alleged witches in the area. Now, let's consider the broader impact of these trials on communities. Imagine living in a small village where suddenly accusations of witchcraft begin to surface. Neighbors turn against neighbors, friendships are shattered, and families are torn apart. The trials themselves were often public spectacles, designed to instill fear and reinforce social order. The accused were paraded through the streets, subjected to humiliating interrogations, and often tortured in full view of the community. This created a climate of intense anxiety, where people were afraid to speak their minds, challenge authority, or even simply behave in a way that might be interpreted as suspicious. The constant threat of accusation loomed over everyone, creating a climate of self-censorship and conformity. We also must discuss the very real role that economic factors had on these trials. The accused were frequently the most vulnerable members of society: poor widows, elderly women living alone, or those who were simply different or ostracized. Accusations of witchcraft could be a way to settle old scores, eliminate rivals, or seize property. In some cases, wealthy individuals used witchcraft accusations to silence dissent or consolidate their power. The trials, therefore, weren't simply about religious belief or superstition. They were also about power, control, and economic advantage. Beyond the fear and division, the witch hunts also had a devastating impact on the social fabric of communities. The execution or banishment of accused witches often left gaping holes in the local economy and social support networks. Women, who were disproportionately accused, played vital roles in their communities as healers, midwives, and caretakers. Their loss could have a profound effect on the well-being of families and the community as a whole. The stigma associated with witchcraft could also extend to the families of the accused, making it difficult for them to find work, marry, or even simply live in peace. The shadow of the witch hunts could linger for generations, perpetuating cycles of poverty and social exclusion. Let's talk about the accusers for a minute. These could be children or neighbors, and they were under just as much pressure. If they named names, the pressure might subside. Consider the accusations of children in the Salem trials. If you are a child and an adult is ordering you or coercing you to name names, you have that pressure. It's also easy to forget that many accused individuals were never formally tried or executed. Suspicion alone could be enough to ruin a person's life. Accused witches might be ostracized, driven from their homes, or subjected to informal punishments, such as public shaming or physical abuse. Even if they were eventually cleared of the charges, the damage to their reputation and social standing could be irreparable. They might be forced to live as outcasts, constantly looking over their shoulders, and forever branded as witches in the eyes of their community. The stories of the accused and their communities are a stark reminder of the dangers of fear, prejudice, and unchecked power. They remind us that even in the most seemingly enlightened societies, irrational beliefs and social pressures can lead to terrible injustices. By remembering the victims of the witch hunts and understanding the devastating impact on their communities, we can learn valuable lessons about the importance of critical thinking, tolerance, and the protection of human rights. So as we drift off, let's remember these individuals, not as sensational figures of folklore, but as real people who suffered immensely during a dark chapter in history. Their stories, though tragic, serve as a powerful reminder of the need for empathy, understanding, and a constant vigilance against the forces of prejudice and fear. All right, let's settle in a bit deeper now, shall we? We've talked about the mechanics of witch hunts, the accusations, the trials, the confessions, all the sort of practical stuff. But what was the actual cost? What did all of this constant fear and suspicion do to the people living through it? Imagine a society where you couldn't trust your neighbor, where a kind word could be misinterpreted, a shared recipe viewed with suspicion. That, my friends, was the reality for many during the peak of the witch hunts. This pervasive fear, this constant low-level anxiety, wormed its way into the very fabric of daily life. Think about it. Every unexplained illness, every crop failure, every bit of bad luck could be attributed to witchcraft. Suddenly, the natural world, once understood through a lens of faith and tradition, became a minefield of potential curses and malevolent intentions. It sowed discord, ripping apart communities that relied on cooperation and mutual support. Families were torn apart by accusations, friendships dissolved in a sea of paranoia, and the simple acts of kindness that bind societies together became fraught with danger. And the worst part, This fear wasn't just an abstract emotion, it had real, tangible consequences. People were ostracized, driven from their homes, even murdered, based on nothing more than rumors and whispers. Imagine the weight of that fear, knowing that a single accusation could destroy your life and the lives of your loved ones. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? But it wasn't just about individual fear. The witch hunts also served as a powerful tool of social control. By targeting marginalized groups, primarily women, especially older women, midwives, and those who didn't quite fit the societal norms, the authorities reinforced existing power structures. It sent a clear message: deviate from the accepted standards of behavior, and you too could face the wrath of the community. This fear of witchcraft was a convenient way to silence dissent, to suppress challenges to authority, and to maintain the status quo. Accusations often arose from personal disputes, land grabs, or simply because someone was considered too outspoken or independent. In effect, the witch hunts became a way to settle scores and to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the established order. Think about the Malleus Maleficarum, that handbook we talked about. It wasn't just a guide to identifying witches, it was a manual for controlling the population. By instilling fear and promoting obedience, it helped to maintain social and political stability, albeit through incredibly cruel and unjust means. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about religious authorities. Secular rulers, local magistrates, and even ordinary citizens played a role in perpetuating the witch hunts. The fear of witchcraft permeated all levels of society, creating a climate of suspicion and intolerance that made it easy for accusations to spread and for innocent people to be condemned. Now, I know all of this sounds incredibly grim, and it is, but it's important to understand the full extent of the impact these witch hunts had on medieval society. It wasn't just about a few isolated trials or the persecution of a small number of individuals. It was about a widespread and pervasive fear that shaped every aspect of daily life, undermining trust, fueling social division, and serving as a tool of social control. Think about the impact on families: children witnessing their mothers accused and tortured, husbands turning on their wives to save themselves, siblings betraying each other in a desperate attempt to avoid suspicion. The emotional scars left by these events must have been immense, passed down through generations, poisoning relationships and creating a legacy of trauma. And what about the economic consequences? The witch hunts disrupted trade, led to the confiscation of property, and created a climate of uncertainty that discouraged investment and innovation. Imagine trying to run a business when you were constantly worried about being accused of witchcraft. How could you possibly focus on your work when your very survival was at stake? Moreover, it diverted resources away from more productive activities. Time and energy were spent on witch hunts instead of things that actually helped the community, like farming, building, or education. It was a huge waste of human potential, all fueled by fear and superstition. The effects were long-lasting. Even after the witch hunts began to decline, the fear and paranoia lingered, shaping social attitudes and influencing legal systems for centuries to come. The legacy of the witch hunts can still be seen in modern-day prejudices, in the way we treat marginalized groups, and in our ongoing struggle to balance individual freedoms with the demands of social order. It's a dark chapter in human history, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked fear and the importance of critical thinking and tolerance. And that, I think, is something worth remembering. Alright, settle in, folks, because tonight we're not just talking about broomsticks and bubbling cauldrons. We're diving into how art and literature shaped, and often distorted, the medieval perception of witches. It's time to explore how these creative mediums unintentionally, or sometimes intentionally, cemented stereotypes that led to very real and very tragic consequences. Think about it. Before the printing press truly took off, and widespread literacy became a thing, images were incredibly powerful. They were the visual language understood by everyone, regardless of their reading ability, and what images were circulating when it came to witches. Mostly, they weren't exactly flattering portraits. Woodcuts, engravings, and paintings, often commissioned by the church or wealthy patrons, depicted witches as grotesque, old hags. Think hooked noses, warts, disheveled hair, and a general air of malevolence. They were rarely, if ever, portrayed as ordinary people, or even as figures of power in a positive light. Instead, they were monstrous caricatures, embodiments of evil, lurking on the fringes of society. These images weren't just idle decorations, they were potent propaganda. They reinforced the idea that witches were easily identifiable, that they were outwardly different from normal people. This, of course, made it much easier to point fingers and fuel suspicion. See that old woman with the stooped back? Doesn't she look a little witchy? The visual cues were already planted in people's minds. Then there's the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a late 15th century treatise that became a sort of instruction manual for witch hunts. While it's primarily a text, many editions included woodcut illustrations that visually reinforced the book's claims. We see images of witches consorting with demons, flying through the air on broomsticks, and engaging in other horrifying acts. These images, presented alongside the text, gave a visual authority to the often ludicrous accusations. It wasn't just words on a page, it was proof rendered in ink and wood, but it wasn't just visual art that perpetuated these stereotypes. Literature, particularly in the form of pamphlets, ballads, and plays, also played a significant role. These mediums, often more accessible to the common person than theological treatises, spread sensationalized stories of witchcraft and devil worship. Consider the popular broadside ballads, cheaply printed single sheets that served as the tabloid headlines of their day. These ballads often told lurid tales of witches casting spells, causing storms, and making pacts with the devil. They were designed to shock and titillate, and they frequently amplified the fear of witchcraft for entertainment purposes. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about selling copies and grabbing attention. Plays, too, exploited the public's fascination with witchcraft. Shakespeare's Macbeth, while a masterpiece of dramatic literature, certainly contributed to the image of witches as malevolent figures lurking in the shadows, stirring up trouble with their prophecies and incantations. The weird sisters in Macbeth are hardly sympathetic characters. They're manipulative, unsettling, and ultimately agents of chaos. And what about the stories themselves? What narratives were being told about witches? Often they were depicted as figures of rebellion, challenging the established social and religious order. This made them particularly threatening to those in power. A witch wasn't just someone who cast spells, she was someone who dared to defy authority, who threatened the stability of the entire community. It's also important to consider the gendered aspect of these portrayals. Witches were overwhelmingly depicted as women, often older, unmarried, or widowed women. This reinforced the societal stereotype that women were more susceptible to temptation, more prone to sin, and inherently weaker than men. The image of the old solitary woman, living on the margins of society, became synonymous with witchcraft. This wasn't accidental. It reflected the patriarchal structures of medieval society, where women's power was often viewed with suspicion and fear. The constant repetition of these stereotypes in art and literature created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more these images and stories circulated, the more people believed them, and the more likely they were to see witches in their own communities. It was a feedback loop of fear and suspicion, fueled by creative representations that often had little to do with reality. It's a sobering thought to consider the impact of these creative representations on the lives of real people. These weren't just fictional characters, they were individuals accused of witchcraft, often based on nothing more than rumor, suspicion, and the pervasive stereotypes perpetuated by art and literature. The consequences were devastating: imprisonment, torture, and ultimately, death. So the next time you see a depiction of a witch in a movie, a painting, or a book, remember the historical context. Remember that these images have a long and often troubling history, and that they played a significant role in shaping the medieval perception of witchcraft. It's a reminder that art and literature can be incredibly powerful tools, capable of both inspiring and misleading, of both illuminating and obscuring the truth. And now perhaps you can close your eyes with a more clear understanding of that intersection. Sleep well. Okay, let's gently settle into our topic for tonight, reclaiming the narrative of witchcraft in modern paganism. It's a bit of a journey, a soft uncovering of stories, and a reconnection with something that's been misunderstood for, well, quite a while. So when we think about witchcraft as presented during the medieval witch hunts, it's often drenched in negativity and fear, isn't it? Devil worship, harming neighbors, causing misfortune. It's a grim picture. But that's just one angle. Modern paganism, and Wicca in particular, offers a radically different perspective. It looks back, often past the witch hunts, to find the roots of witchcraft in older nature-based spiritualities. Think of it as turning over a stone to see what's underneath, what existed before the intense persecution. Many modern pagans find echoes of ancient practices, honoring the earth, celebrating seasonal changes, working with herbs and natural energies. These are seen as threads connecting to pre-Christian European traditions, although the historical evidence for a direct, unbroken line is fuzzy at best. But the feeling of connection, the sense of resonance, is very real for practitioners. Now, a key part of this reclaiming is reinterpreting what witchcraft actually means. It's not about evil spells or making pacts with demons. Instead, it's about working with natural energies to bring about positive change. It's about personal empowerment, taking responsibility for your life, and understanding your place in the interconnected web of existence. Many modern witches see themselves as healers, counselors, and stewards of the earth. They're creating positive change in the world around them, as they would define it anyway. Ritual is incredibly important here. Many modern pagan traditions incorporate ritual to mark significant life events, honor the seasons, or focus intention on specific goals. These rituals often involve calling upon deities, both ancient and newly conceptualized, or working with the elements, earth, air, fire, and water. It's not about controlling the elements, but about harmonizing with them, learning from them, and drawing strength from them. Think of it as tuning into the natural world. And let's talk about deities for a moment. The idea of a single, all-powerful god isn't necessarily central to modern paganism. Many traditions honor a goddess, often seen as the embodiment of the earth and feminine energy, alongside a god, representing the sun and masculine energy. These deities aren't necessarily literal beings, but can be viewed as archetypes, representing different aspects of the divine. There's a beautiful flexibility here. Many practitioners also work with deities from other pantheons: Greek, Roman, Celtic, Egyptian. It really depends on what resonates with them personally. It's worth mentioning that Wicca, as founded by Gerald Gardner in the mid-20th century, played a massive role in shaping modern pagan witchcraft. Gardner drew upon a variety of sources: folklore, ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, to create a new religious path that centered on nature worship and the practice of magic. His work, and that of his followers, helped to popularize the idea of witchcraft as a positive, life-affirming spiritual practice. Of course, Wicca is just one path among many within modern paganism. There are many other traditions with their own unique beliefs and practices. The concept of magic itself gets a makeover here. It's not about pulling rabbits out of hats or turning people into frogs. Instead, it's often defined as the art of changing consciousness at will. It's about focusing your intention, visualizing your goals, and using ritual and symbolism to bring those goals into reality. Think of it as a form of applied psychology, using the power of the mind to shape your life. It is, in theory anyway. Ethics are a really core principle in modern pagan witchcraft. The Wiccan Reader, which states, "And it harm none, do what ye will," is a widely known guiding principle. The idea is that you're free to make your own choices, but you're also responsible for the consequences of those choices. Harm no one, including yourself. So, magic isn't supposed to be used to manipulate or control others. It's about working in harmony with the universe, respecting the free will of all beings. There is, of course, inner work too. Many modern witches see witchcraft as a path of self-discovery. It's about exploring your own inner landscape, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, and becoming the best version of yourself. Meditation, journaling, and shadow work, confronting and integrating the darker aspects of your personality, are all common practices. It's a path of self-improvement, but one that's deeply rooted in spirituality and connection to the natural world. In reclaiming the narrative, modern pagan witches are also pushing back against negative stereotypes. They are actively working to educate the public about their beliefs and practices, challenging misconceptions and promoting tolerance and understanding. This can involve everything from writing books and blogs to organizing public rituals to simply being open and honest about their faith in their daily lives. They are trying to normalize what has been intentionally othered for so long. So, it's a really big shift, right? From seeing witchcraft as something inherently evil to seeing it as a path of healing, empowerment, and connection. Modern pagan witchcraft offers a way to reconnect with nature, find meaning in ritual, and take responsibility for your own life. It's a reclaiming of power, a reinterpretation of history, and a celebration of the divine in all its forms. And hopefully, now, it's just a little less boring. Alright, settle in everyone, because tonight we're tackling something a little off about how we picture medieval witchcraft. You see, pop culture, movies, TV shows, books, they've given us a very specific image, and it's mostly wrong. It's not their fault, exactly. Dramatic stories need drama, but the truth, as always, is far more nuanced and, frankly, a lot more interesting. And yes, also boring. So perfect for sleep. So what are some of these modern misconceptions? Let's start with the really big one. The idea of the all-powerful spell-slinging witch. You know, the kind who can conjure storms with a flick of the wrist, turn princes into frogs, or fly around on broomsticks cackling maniacally. That's not really a medieval thing. The medieval understanding of witchcraft was far more grounded, much more human. Think of it this way, magic, in the medieval mind, wasn't something anyone could just learn. It was almost always believed to come from a pact with the devil. This is crucial. The power didn't originate with the witch, it came from him. And that meant that even the most supposedly powerful witch was in essence a puppet, a tool. They weren't independent actors wielding awesome power. They were the middleman for evil. Think of them as a bad customer service rep for the devil. And this also ties into another big misconception, the idea of elaborate rituals and covens. Oh sure, the Malleus Maleficarum, that delightful little book we talked about earlier. It describes all sorts of wild Sabbath rituals, complete with devil worship and cannibalism. But that was largely fantasy propaganda designed to incite fear and justify the witch hunts. The truth is, most accused witches weren't part of any organized group. They were isolated individuals, often women, who were suspected of using maleficame, evil magic, to harm their neighbors. Maleficame could be anything from causing crops to fail, making someone sick, or even just having a really bad temper and giving someone the stink eye. If old Agnes was accused of witchcraft, it wasn't because she was leading a coven in the forest. It was usually because her neighbor's cow stopped giving milk, and Agnes was the one who last saw the cow. Small stuff, right? Horrifying small stuff. Another common misconception is that everyone in the Middle Ages believed in witchcraft. We tend to think of them as being uniformly superstitious, but that's not true at all. There were always skeptics, educated people, clergy members even, who questioned the validity of witch trials and the existence of witchcraft altogether. They were often shouted down, of course, or even accused of heresy themselves, but their skepticism existed, and it grew stronger over time, contributing to the eventual decline of the witch hunts. They asked questions, they used some logic and reason, but the fear was often too strong for them. Then there's the whole aesthetic of the medieval witch. Thanks to movies and TV, we picture them as wearing pointy hats, riding broomsticks, and surrounded by black cats. Now, did some people wear pointy hats? Sure. Did they ride broomsticks? Probably, for sweeping. Were black cats common? Absolutely. But none of those things were inherently linked to witchcraft in the medieval mind. The pointy hat, for example, is more associated with, well, nobody really knows for sure. It might have been a way to identify Jews in some areas. It might have just been a fashionable hat style. It certainly wasn't some kind of magical antenna for receiving demonic transmissions. And cats? Well, cats were valued for their ability to control rodent populations. The association with witchcraft came later, as part of the demonization of accused women. And the broomstick? The theory that witches used hallucinogenic ointments and rode broomsticks as a means of, well, let's just say self-medication is largely a modern invention based on very little historical evidence. It's a fun theory, and it makes for a great visual, but it's not exactly historically accurate. Sorry. Finally, let's talk about the victims themselves. Pop culture often portrays witches as, well, sometimes they're evil crones, sometimes they're misunderstood heroines. But the reality is far more complex. The accused witches were real people. They were your neighbors, your friends, your family members. They were often vulnerable individuals, poor women, elderly widows, people who were simply different. They were scapegoats caught in a web of fear, suspicion, and social unrest. It's important to remember their humanity, to see them not as figures of myth and legend, but as real people who suffered unimaginable injustice. They were not evil. They were not magic. They were victims. So next time you see a movie about medieval witchcraft, remember that the reality was far more complex, far more human, and far more tragic, and hopefully a little more conducive to sleep. Good night. The final witch trials, when belief persisted. Even as the Enlightenment began to dawn, casting its rational light across Europe, the embers of witch panic continued to flicker in isolated pockets. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That even as scientific thinking advanced, the old fears, the ingrained superstitions, refused to be entirely extinguished. Let's drift back now. These later trials, occurring mainly in the 18th century, are fascinating because they highlight the stubborn resilience of deeply held beliefs in the face of growing skepticism. The Enlightenment certainly influenced many intellectuals and lawmakers, leading to reforms in legal systems and a gradual decline in prosecutions for witchcraft. But for many ordinary people, particularly in rural and isolated communities, the old worldview, the world populated by malevolent spirits and influenced by magical forces, remained very much alive. So who were these final victims? Unlike the widespread panics of the 16th and 17th centuries, these later trials often involved fewer people, sometimes just a single individual accused of harming their neighbors through magical means. The cases tend to be localized, arising from personal disputes, illnesses, or misfortunes within a small community. Imagine a farming village struggling with crop failures or livestock sickness. When rational explanations failed, the old habit of blaming witchcraft reasserted itself. A woman perhaps already marginalized because of her age, her poverty, or her unusual behavior could easily become the scapegoat. One of the most well-known late cases is that of Anna Goldie, executed in Glarus, Switzerland, in 1782. Now her story is particularly poignant. Anna was accused of bewitching a young girl in her employ, causing her to suffer from fits and to vomit pins. The trial was orchestrated by the girl's father, a physician and local magistrate, who appeared determined to prove Anna's guilt. Despite a lack of concrete evidence, and amidst growing public concern about the fairness of the proceedings, Anna was convicted and beheaded. The execution was a major scandal, even at the time, and it led to widespread condemnation and calls for legal reform. Years later, in 2008, Anna Goldie was officially exonerated, her case becoming a symbol of the injustice and irrationality of witch trials. Another example comes from Scotland, where the last execution for witchcraft took place in 1727. Janet Horne, an elderly woman from Sutherland, was accused of using witchcraft to turn her daughter into a pony, and then having her shod by the devil. The accusations were fueled by local gossip and personal animosity, and Janet, who was likely suffering from mental illness, was found guilty and burned at the stake. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? In the early 18th century, a woman being burned alive for such absurd accusations. These later trials weren't simply about a resurgence of belief in witchcraft. They also reflected deeper social tensions and power struggles within communities. Accusations were sometimes used as weapons in personal vendettas, as a way to silence dissent or to control marginalized groups. The accused were often women who challenged social norms, who possessed knowledge or skills that were viewed with suspicion, or who simply found themselves on the wrong side of a local dispute. It's important to remember that the decline of witch trials wasn't a neat, linear process. Skepticism and legal reforms gradually reduced the number of prosecutions, but the underlying beliefs in witchcraft persisted for much longer. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries, there were occasional outbreaks of witch panics in some parts of Europe and North America, often triggered by specific events or social anxieties. The case of Anna Goldie and Janet Horne remind us that even in the face of progress, deeply rooted fears and prejudices can persist. These final victims serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, the abuse of power, and the enduring human tendency to seek scapegoats in times of uncertainty. Their stories are a call for vigilance, a warning against the dangers of irrationality and intolerance. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us remember them and reflect on the lessons of their tragic fates. All right, let's settle in for a bit now and think about what all those witch hunts actually did. I mean, beyond the obvious, the tragic loss of life, the fear, what lasting changes did they leave behind in the way we organize ourselves? You see, the witch hunts weren't just a bunch of isolated incidents. They were a symptom of deeper issues, a reflection of anxieties and power struggles that were already present in medieval and early modern Europe. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they also ended up changing the legal and social structures of the time in some pretty significant ways. One of the most direct impacts was on the legal systems themselves. Think about it. These trials were often, well, let's just say creative, with the rules of evidence. Hearsay, rumors, and even dreams were often enough to condemn someone. Torture, as we talked about earlier, was used to extract confessions, making a mockery of any semblance of due process. This reliance on shaky evidence and coerced confessions actually prompted some legal scholars to rethink the way trials were conducted. There was a slow, gradual shift towards more rigorous standards of evidence. Lawyers and judges started demanding more concrete proof before convicting someone, especially in cases where the accused faced the death penalty. Now, this didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't eliminate all abuses, but it did mark a step towards a more, let's say, rational approach to justice. The witch hunts also highlighted the dangers of unchecked power. Often, accusations were driven by personal vendettas, social rivalries, or even just plain old paranoia. This prompted some rulers and legal authorities to try and rein in the power of local witch finders and inquisitors. Some regions started requiring central approval for witch trials, or appointing independent investigators to oversee the process. It was a way of trying to prevent, well, things getting out of hand, which, let's be honest, they very often did. But the effects weren't just limited to the legal realm. The witch hunts also had a profound impact on social structures and attitudes. The accusations often targeted marginalized members of society, women, the poor, the elderly, people who were seen as different in some way. This created a climate of fear and suspicion, where anyone could be accused and where neighbor could turn against neighbor. This climate of fear had a chilling effect on social life. People became more hesitant to express unconventional opinions, to challenge authority, or even to offer help to those in need, for fear of attracting suspicion. It fostered a culture of conformity, where fitting in and avoiding attention became paramount. And then there's the issue of gender. The witch hunts, as we've discussed, disproportionately targeted women. This wasn't just a matter of coincidence. It reflected deep-seated anxieties about female power, sexuality, and independence. The witch trials reinforced patriarchal norms and served as a warning to women who dared to challenge those norms. The legacy of this gendered persecution continues to resonate even today. It contributed to the stereotype of women as inherently more susceptible to evil, more prone to temptation, and less rational than men. These stereotypes, sadly, have persisted in various forms throughout history, shaping attitudes towards women in everything from politics to the workplace. It's worth noting that the witch hunts also had a perhaps unintended consequence of promoting skepticism and rationalism. As people began to question the validity of witch trials, they also started to question other forms of superstition and religious dogma. The rise of scientific thinking in the 16th and 17th centuries was partly fueled by a growing distrust of traditional authorities and a desire to understand the world through reason and observation. Thinkers like René Descartes and Isaac Newton, who revolutionized our understanding of the universe, were also products of an era that was grappling with the legacy of the witch hunts. Their emphasis on empirical evidence and logical reasoning was a direct challenge to the kind of unsubstantiated claims and irrational fears that had fueled the witch trials. So when we look at the legacy of the witch hunts, it's not just a story of tragedy and injustice, though it certainly is that. It's also a story of how societies learn, adapt, and sometimes even progress in the face of adversity. The witch hunts prompted legal reforms, challenged patriarchal norms, and fostered a spirit of skepticism that helped pave the way for the scientific revolution. Of course, the echoes of the witch hunts can still be felt today. The dangers of mass hysteria, the abuse of power, the persecution of marginalized groups. These are issues that continue to confront us in different forms. The history of the witch hunt serves as a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, due process, and respect for human rights. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of self-reflection might not hurt either. Alright, let's really settle in now. We've explored the accusations, the confessions, the hunts themselves, but what was really going on? How did seemingly normal communities descend into such widespread paranoia and violence? The key, my friend, lies in understanding the psychology of mass hysteria. Now, mass hysteria, also known as collective hysteria or collective obsessional behavior, isn't about everyone suddenly going crazy. It's far more nuanced. Think of it as a social phenomenon where anxiety and stress amplify existing fears and beliefs within a group, leading to irrational behaviors and shared delusions. And in the medieval period, those anxieties and fears were plentiful, weren't they? Life was precarious. Disease, famine, war, and religious uncertainty were constant companions. People were looking for explanations, for someone to blame when things went wrong. The church offered solace, yes, but also instilled a deep fear of the devil and his influence. The idea that evil forces were constantly at work, ready to corrupt the faithful, was deeply ingrained in the medieval mindset. And when crops failed, or a child fell ill, the devil's hand seemed the most logical explanation. Now add to this potent mix the power of suggestion. Consider the role of charismatic individuals, often religious figures or self-proclaimed witch hunters. These figures could, intentionally or unintentionally, amplify existing anxieties and direct them towards specific targets. Their pronouncements, their sermons, their very presence could act as a catalyst, setting off a chain reaction of accusations and fear. Think about it. A respected member of the community points the finger at someone, whispering suspicions about their dealings with the devil. This seed of doubt, planted in fertile ground already tilled by fear and superstition, begins to grow. Others, eager to prove their own piety and avoid suspicion themselves, chime in, adding their own observations, their own interpretations of events. And this is where suggestibility really kicks in. Remember, most people in the medieval period were illiterate. They relied on oral tradition, on hearsay, for their information. So if enough people believed something, it became accepted as truth, regardless of actual evidence. This is called confirmation bias, and it is powerful. The accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by fear and a desperate need for answers. And as more people were accused, the pressure to confess increased. We've already talked about the role of torture, and its importance cannot be overstated. But even without physical coercion, the social pressure, the isolation, the sheer terror of being accused of witchcraft could be enough to break someone. And what happened when someone confessed? Well, that confession, no matter how coerced or unreliable, served as proof that witchcraft was real, that the devil was at work, and that the witch hunters were justified in their actions. It created a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforcing the existing beliefs and fueling the hysteria even further. It was like a negative feedback loop, spiraling more and more violently. Furthermore, remember the Malleus Maleficarum, which we discussed before. This book systematized the process and the knowledge on which people were drawing to identify witches. It provided a framework, a language, even a script for the witch hunts, giving people a structure within which to interpret events and accusations. It provided a template for confessions, a set of beliefs that once adopted could make even the most outlandish accusations seem plausible. It provided the vocabulary for the accusations and the justifications for the torture. It turned fear and suspicion into a kind of science, and it justified everything under the auspices of God. And finally, consider the social dynamics at play. Accusations of witchcraft were often used as a tool for social control, for settling scores, for silencing dissent. Those who challenged authority, those who deviated from social norms, those who were simply disliked or envied, were particularly vulnerable to accusations. In many communities, women, especially older, unmarried women, were disproportionately targeted. Why? Because they were often seen as independent, as outside the patriarchal structure of society. They were easy targets, scapegoats for the community's anxieties and frustrations. Gender, as we spoke about earlier, played a major role. The phenomenon of mass hysteria wasn't unique to witchcraft accusations. It has manifested throughout history in various forms, from religious revivals to political panics. But the witch hunts of the medieval period offer a particularly chilling example of how fear, superstition, and social pressure can combine to create a climate of terror and injustice. Understanding the psychology of mass hysteria helps us to see the witch hunts not as the product of individual madness, but as a complex social phenomenon, a dark chapter in human history that serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked fear and the importance of critical thinking. It reminds us, doesn't it, to question our own beliefs, to be wary of easy answers, and to remember that even in the darkest of times, reason and compassion must prevail. Now, let's all take a long, slow breath. Imagine that you're exhaling all that tension, all that fear. Imagine you're in a safe, calming place. You are, and we are here, together. So where does that leave witchcraft today? After all the trials, the burnings, and the centuries of fear, it might surprise you to know that belief in witchcraft and the practice of it is far from extinct. In fact, it's experiencing something of a resurgence. Now, before you picture hooded figures chanting around a bubbling cauldron under a full moon, well, that might be part of it for some. But the reality is far more nuanced and varied. Modern perspectives on witchcraft are incredibly diverse, ranging from Wicca and other forms of neo-paganism to solitary practitioners drawing on a mix of traditions and personal intuition. Wicca, perhaps the most well-known form of modern witchcraft, emerged in England in the mid-20th century. It's a religion that emphasizes reverence for nature, the worship of a goddess and a god, and the practice of magic for positive purposes. Wiccans often celebrate seasonal festivals called sabbats, marking the solstices and equinoxes, much like some ancient pagan traditions. It's important to remember that Wicca, like many other religions, has many different forms. What one practitioner believes and does might not be the same for another. But witchcraft today isn't just about Wicca. There are countless other paths, each with its own unique approach. Some witches focus on herbalism and healing, using plant-based remedies and energy work to promote well-being. Others are drawn to divination, using tools like tarot cards, runes, or scrying mirrors to gain insight into the future or understand the present. Still others focus on spellcraft, using rituals and incantations to manifest desired outcomes. A key difference between modern witchcraft and the witchcraft of the medieval period is the intention behind the practice. While medieval witchcraft was often associated with malevolence and harm, modern witches generally emphasize ethical considerations and the importance of using magic responsibly. The Wiccan Rede, and it harm none, do what you will, is a common guiding principle. This means that most modern practitioners actively avoid any magic intended to cause harm or manipulate others against their will. It's also worth noting that many modern witches identify as feminists, seeing witchcraft as a way to reclaim female power and challenge patriarchal structures. The historical association of witchcraft with women, particularly those who were marginalized or independent-minded, resonates deeply with many who seek to empower themselves and others. For some, the goddess worship inherent in many Wiccan and neo-pagan traditions provides a much-needed counterbalance to male-dominated religious landscapes. Now let's be clear, not everyone who identifies as a witch is a practitioner of magic. For some, it's a cultural identity, a way of connecting with their ancestry or expressing their values. For others, it's a spiritual path, a way of finding meaning and purpose in the world, and for still others, it's a combination of all these things. But what about the darker side of witchcraft? The curses, the hexes, the rituals intended to cause harm. While most modern witches reject such practices, there are still some who identify as left-hand path practitioners, focusing on darker aspects of magic. However, these individuals are a minority, and their practices are often controversial, even within the witchcraft community. And of course, there's the question of belief. Do modern witches really believe that their spells and rituals have a tangible effect on the world? The answer is complex and varies from person to person. Some see magic as a form of energy work, manipulating subtle forces to influence events. Others view it as a psychological tool, a way to focus their intentions and manifest their desires. And still others see it as a symbolic practice, a way of connecting with the divine or expressing their inner selves. Interestingly, despite the rise of scientific rationalism, belief in witchcraft and other forms of the paranormal persists even outside of organized witchcraft communities. Polls consistently show that a significant percentage of people believe in things like psychic abilities, ghosts, and curses. These beliefs are often intertwined with cultural traditions, folklore, and personal experiences. You might be surprised to hear these beliefs aren't confined to any specific part of the world. While often associated with certain cultures or regions, you can find people who believe believe in witchcraft in all corners of the globe, adapting traditional beliefs to modern contexts. In some parts of the world, these beliefs are deeply ingrained in daily life, influencing everything from healthcare decisions to social interactions. So why does this belief persist? Well, there are many possible explanations. For some, it's a way of making sense of the world, of finding explanations for events that seem inexplicable. For others, it's a way of coping with uncertainty, of feeling like they have some control over their lives. And for still others, it's simply a matter of tradition, of passing down beliefs and practices from one generation to the next. One thing is certain, the story of witchcraft is far from over. From the medieval witch hunts to the modern resurgence of Wicca and other forms of neo-paganism, witchcraft continues to fascinate, intrigue, and even frighten us. And as long as there are unexplained mysteries, anxieties, and desires, it's likely that belief in witchcraft, in some form or another, will continue to persist. And so, our journey into the shadowed corners of medieval witchcraft draws to a close. What have we uncovered in this exploration of fear, faith, and folklore? It's easy to dismiss these stories as relics of a bygone era, a testament to ignorance and superstition, but to do so would be to miss the crucial echoes they hold for our present. The witch hunts weren't simply about magic, they were about power, about control, about the anxieties that bubbled beneath the surface of a society grappling with immense change. Think back to the societal structure we discussed. When established orders feel threatened, scapegoats are often found. In the medieval world, those who challenged the status quo, women, the poor, the outspoken, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Remember the Malleus Maleficarum? It wasn't just a book, it was a weapon, a tool used to justify persecution and solidify a particular narrative. It painted women as inherently susceptible to evil, reinforcing existing prejudices and paving the way for horrific acts of violence. And violence, sadly, became commonplace. The confessions extracted under torture, the trials driven by paranoia, the executions carried out with a chilling efficiency, these weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper societal malaise. Looking back, we can see how easily fear can be manipulated, how quickly mass hysteria can take hold, the whispers, the accusations, the snowballing effect of rumor and suspicion. These are patterns that can be observed throughout history, and indeed in our own time. Consider the role of social media today. How easily can misinformation spread? How quickly can a rumor become truth in the echo chambers of the internet? The dynamics are eerily familiar. The witch hunts also highlight the dangers of unchecked authority. When those in power are able to define what is acceptable and what is not, when dissent is silenced and evidence is ignored, injustice is inevitable. Think of the witch hunters themselves, the experts who profited from the persecution of others. They were driven not just by fear, but also by ambition, by a desire to maintain their position of authority. Perhaps one of the most important lessons we can glean from the history of medieval witchcraft is the importance of critical thinking, to question assumptions, to demand evidence, to resist the urge to blindly follow the crowd. These are essential skills in any age. The people accused of witchcraft were often outsiders, individuals who didn't fit neatly into the established social order. They were healers, midwives, women who possessed knowledge that was both valued and feared. By silencing them, society lost valuable skills and perspectives. And even worse, that knowledge was replaced by a story of lies and mistruths. Today, we may not believe in witches in the same way that medieval people did, but we still grapple with questions of identity, belonging, and the role of tradition. We still struggle to understand those who are different from us, and we still face the temptation to simplify complex issues, to find easy answers in the face of uncertainty. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, I hope you'll carry with you not just the chilling tales of medieval witchcraft, but also a renewed commitment to critical thinking, to empathy, and to a healthy skepticism of those in power. The past may be a foreign country, but its lessons are timeless. By remembering the mistakes of our ancestors, we can strive to build a more just and compassionate world for ourselves and for generations to come. And that, perhaps, is the most important magic of all.